The Alpha King had Luna's hair, cut for his mistress. By midnight, the entire kingdom trembled. They found him 3 days after the ambush, buried under 6 feet of Black River mud, with a broken spear still lodged between his ribs, and not one soul in Hrafunmark recognized their own sovereign until a 19-year-old bride they had traded away, like cattle pressed 2 fingers to his throat, and said calmly, "He's not dead. He's poisoned, and whoever did this used nightroot, the same poison that killed 11 men in my father's hall, and I am the only person left alive who knows the antidote. If you have ever been handed to a stranger as payment for a war you didn't start, if you have ever been underestimated by every single person in the room while you quietly held their fate in your hands, comment the city you're watching from right now, and hit that follow button, because by the time this story reaches its final hour, the entire kingdom of Hrafunmark will be on its knees before a woman they called nothing more than a broodmare. Ylva Sturlsdottir had not cried on the day her father sold her to end a war. She had counted the wagons instead, 6, loaded with grain her people would never see again, and she had memorized the faces of the men who came to collect her, because her mother had taught her, before the sickness took her, that survival belonged to those who watched instead of wept. Ylva was 20 years old, narrow-boned and quiet, with pale gray eyes that darkened to near black when she was afraid, and lightened to silver when she was not. She wore her hair in a single braid down her spine, the color of wet ash, and she carried, sewn into the hem of her traveling cloak, a leather roll of dried herbs that no one had thought to search for, because no one imagined a bride worth watching. The treaty was simple, in the way that all cruel things are simple. Hrafunmark and Ostmark had bled each other for 11 years, over a strip of contested coastline, and the only thing that stopped the killing was an exchange. Ylva, daughter of a minor Ostmark lord, sent north to marry into Hrafunmark's ruling pack, as a living seal on the peace. She was not told who she would marry. She was told only that the sovereign of Hrafunmark, a man called Bjorn Ulfsson, the Wolf King, had agreed to the match, and that refusal would restart a war that had already taken her 2 older brothers. She rode north for 19 days in a covered wagon that smelled of pine tar and fear, escorted by Ostmark soldiers who would not meet her eyes, and Hrafunmark guards who watched her like she might be carrying a blade under her tongue. On the 20th day, 3 miles from the border river, the wagon train was ambushed. It happened at dusk, when the light goes the color of a bruise and every shadow doubles. Ylva heard the first scream before she saw anything, a wet, short sound, cut off, and then the wagon lurched sideways as the horses bolted, and she was thrown against the wooden slats hard enough to taste blood. Through the canvas flap she saw men in black wolf pelts falling on the Ostmark escort with a speed that no human fighter possessed, claws where hands should have been, eyes gone amber and lit from within like coals. She had heard the stories of the northern pack all her life, shifters, wolf-blooded, a bloodline that could tear a man open with its bare hands. But hearing a story and watching 6 soldiers die in under a minute were not the same thing. She did not scream. She pressed herself flat against the wagon floor, pulled her cloak over her head, and stayed still long enough that when the attackers finally tore the canvas open, they found what looked like a corpse already, pale and unmoving, and moved on to strip the wagon of its grain instead. She lay there through the whole of the night, listening to the river, until the only sound left was water. When she finally crawled out at first light, she found the second body. He was half buried in the mud bank where the current had dragged him, one arm flung wide, his face turned into the silt, so that at first she thought he was simply another dead soldier. But his chest moved, barely. A shallow, wrong rhythm, too slow, with a rattle underneath it that Ylva recognized the way she recognized her own name, because she had heard that exact rattle in her father's hall 4 years ago, when 11 men died over the course of a single night after eating from a poisoned cask, and her mother, before she too succumbed to the sickness that took her the following winter, had spent 3 sleepless days trying every antidote she knew. Ylva rolled him onto his back. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet even folded in the mud, built like something carved rather than born, with a spear wound still weeping black-red beneath a cracked breastplate stamped with a wolf's head in silver, the sigil of the Hraffenmark royal line. His hair was dark gold, matted with river silt, and even unconscious his jaw was set like a man mid-argument. She did not know his name. She did not know he was her betrothed. She knew only that his lips had gone the faint blue-gray of nightroot poisoning, and that without treatment within the day, he would be dead by morning. She had 11 hours, by her mother's old counting, before the poison reached his heart. She dragged him, inch by furious inch, her shoulders screaming, her boots sinking to the ankle in mud, to a half-collapsed hunting shelter she found a quarter-mile upriver, log walls with one intact wall, and a roof of pine boughs gone soft and green with moss. Twice she had to stop entirely, chest heaving, palms raw where the rope of her cloak cord had bitten into them, and twice Fa made herself keep moving anyway, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that she was alone on foreign ground, with a dying stranger twice her weight, and no one within 3 miles who would come if she screamed. It took her the better part of an hour. By the time she got him inside, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unroll her herb kit, but she made herself breathe the way her mother had taught her. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, until the shaking stopped being about fear and started being about work. Nightroot bloomed only in 3 places she knew of, all of them south, all of them nowhere near Hraffenmark's territory, which meant someone had carried it here on purpose. That detail she filed away and did not examine yet. There would be time for that later. First, the antidote: crushed silverleaf root, boiled hawthorn bark, and 3 drops of her own blood, because nightroot bonded to iron in the blood of its victim and needed a fresh binding agent to be drawn out, a trick her mother had learned from a healer 2 villages over and never had the chance to use again before she died. Ylva had exactly enough silverleaf in her kit for 1 dose. She would not get a second attempt. She built a fire with flint she'd stolen from the wagon stores, boiled river water in a dented cup she found among the shelter's old supplies, and worked through the night with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world, the dead soldiers, the ambush, the fact that she was now entirely alone in enemy territory, simply cease to exist. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, the giant stranger's eyes opened, just barely, amber gold and glassy with fever, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop even through his delirium. "Poison," he rasped, the word barely a shape. "I know," she said. "Nightroot. I have the antidote. Hold still." He did not hold still, not really. His body convulsed twice as the poison fought the cure, and both times she had to throw her whole weight across his chest to keep him from tearing the wound open further, which should have been laughable, her 130 pounds against his mass, except that in his weakened state it was almost enough. By dawn, his breathing had steadied. By mid-morning, the blue-gray had faded from his lips. By midday, he was awake enough to ask her name, and strong enough, despite everything, to notice that she flinched when he tried to sit up too fast, and to say, in a voice gone rough with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite suspicion, "You should have let me die. Half my own court would have paid you to." "Then it's fortunate," Ylva said, "that I don't work for your court." That was the first open loop, though she did not know it yet. Someone inside Hraffenmark's own pack had wanted their sovereign dead, badly enough to import a southern poison and stage an ambush disguised as a border raid, and the only person who could prove it was a girl with dried herbs sewn into her cloak hem. He told her his name 3 hours later, once he could stand without swaying. Bjorn Ulfsson, sovereign of Hraffenmark, the Wolf King, and when she told him hers, something shifted behind his eyes, recognition, calculation, and beneath both, an emotion he clearly hadn't expected to feel, because the bride he'd been sent to collect at the border crossing, the one his advisors described to him as a political nicety, a quiet girl, worth nothing but her father's signature on a treaty, was the same woman who had just spent a night pulling poison out of his blood with her bare hands and a stolen cooking pot. That was the second open loop. He did not yet know how to reconcile the woman in front of him with the story he'd been told about her, and the gap between those 2 things would nearly get her killed before the month was out. The third loop planted itself quietly, almost as an afterthought, when Bjorn finally got a proper look at the wound beneath his cracked breastplate and went very still. "This spear," he said. "It's not an Ostmark blade. Look at the fluting on the shaft." Ylva looked. The metalwork was fine, deliberate, stamped near the base with a mark she didn't recognize but which made Bjorn's jaw lock so hard a muscle jumped beneath his ear. He said nothing more about it. But she saw, in that instant, that whoever had ordered this ambush wanted it to look like an Ostmark strike, wanted the fragile new piece shattered, and that the real hand behind the spear belonged to someone inside his own hall. They reached the outer edge of Hrafnmark's territory 2 days later, Bjorn still weak enough to lean on her shoulder for the last mile, which was how the entire border garrison saw their sovereign arrive, not carried in triumph, but held upright by a mud-streaked, exhausted foreign bride nobody in the fortress had been told to expect yet. Word of it reached the capital before they did. The fortress hall of Hrafnmark rose out of black stone at the center of a valley ringed by pine. Its great hall built around a central hearth, wide enough to roast an ox, wolf-pelt banners hanging from rafters carved with running wolves, the whole place smelling of wood smoke and tallow and, faintly, beneath it all, of wet fur, a scent Ylva would spend weeks learning to recognize as simply the smell of the pack itself, present in every hallway whether or not anyone had shifted in days. Ylva had imagined, on the long ride north, that she might arrive to some ceremony, however small. Instead, she arrived to whispers, to 100 pairs of eyes assessing her mud-crusted boots and torn hem, to a young man with Bjorn's same amber eyes and none of his gravity, stepping forward, with a smile that did not reach them. "So this is her," the young man said, "the broodmare from Ostmark. I expected someone prettier for the price of 6 wagons of grain." A ripple of laughter moved through the assembled court. This was Sigmar, Bjorn's younger cousin and the garrison's favored second, a man who had spent the ambush's aftermath quietly enjoying his older cousin's absence, and now seemed almost disappointed that it hadn't lasted. "Careful, cousin," Bjorn said, low and dangerous. But Sigmar only laughed harder, and Ylva filed the insult away exactly as she'd filed the spear mark 2 days before, not forgotten, simply waiting. The court physician, an anxious, soft-handed man named Toke, arrived to examine Bjorn's wound and pronounced it healing remarkably for a poisoning of that severity, though he seemed reluctant to meet Ylva's eyes when she described the exact compound she'd used to save him, and reluctant, too, to explain why the antidote he himself had once prepared for a similar case, a case Bjorn mentioned offhand, from 2 winters past, when a hunting party had come back poisoned, had failed to work at all. Ylva noted that as well, a healer who could not identify nightroot in a hall stocked with an antidote that had already failed once before. She said nothing yet. She had learned, in her father's hall, that accusations made too early simply taught the guilty to hide better. Only one person in that first hour looked at her with something other than suspicion or mockery. An old woman near the hearth, gray-braided, her hands gnarled with a lifetime of grinding herbs, who watched Ylva's precise, unhurried movements as she redressed Bjorn's wound with river-clean linen and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That's not a court hand. That's a healer's hand." Her name was Gudrun, keeper of the hall's stores and the only person who had survived 3 sovereigns' reigns without once losing her position, and she would become, over the following weeks, the one ally Ylva had inside Hrafnmark's walls. Bjorn, for his part, did not know what to do with her. He had spent his adult life being underestimated by no one, feared by most, and the sensation of being saved, genuinely, unglamorously saved, by someone half his size with dirt under her fingernails, sat strangely on him. He watched her more than he spoke to her in those first days, amber eyes following her across the hall with an intensity that unsettled the court and unsettled Ylva more, though she would not have admitted it. When she flinched at Sigmar's 3rd round of insults during the welcome feast, Bjorn's hand closed hard enough around his cup to crack the wood, and he stood, and the entire hall went silent, and he said only, "The next person who mocks the woman who pulled poison from my blood with her bare hands can explain to me personally why they think themselves braver than she is." No one spoke again that night. It was 2 weeks later, at the height of the hall's autumn hunt preparations, that the second attack came, not against Bjorn this time, but against Ylva herself, a stray hunting dog let loose near the herb gardens where she worked each morning, an animal with froth at its jaw and none of the disorientation of true rabies, which Ylva recognized within seconds as another poisoning, a compound meant to induce exactly that symptom in an animal deliberately starved and drugged for the purpose. She killed it with a garden hoe before it reached her, hands steady, heart hammering only after the fact. And when Bjorn arrived at a dead run, Sigmar close behind him wearing an expression of theatrical concern that did not reach his eyes, Ylva looked past both of them, to where Toke the physician stood at the garden's edge, wringing his soft hands, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that the coward who had failed to identify the poison in Bjorn's blood was very likely the same coward supplying it. She did not accuse him, not yet. She had one piece missing, and Gudrun, 3 nights later, over a shared pot of tea in the hall's kitchen stores, gave it to her. "Toke doesn't act alone," Gudrun said, voice pitched low enough that the words barely carried past the two of them. "He's weak, and weak men need someone stronger pulling their strings. Lord Eirik has wanted this hall since Bjorn's father died, and left it to a boy of 20 instead of his own brother. Eirik funded half the border garrisons himself. He has coin enough to buy a physician's silence and a spear forged somewhere no one in Hrafunmark would think to trace it." Ylva thought of the fluted spear shaft, the fine metalwork, the mark Bjorn had gone rigid at, but refused to name. "The spear," she said. "You know whose mark that is." Gudrun's silence was its own answer. Eirik, Bjorn's uncle, was a broad, silver-bearded man who had spent every gathering since Ylva's arrival at the edge of every room, watching, saying little, smiling with exactly the warmth of a man calculating a debt owed to him. She had noticed him before. She had not, until now, understood what she was noticing. The pieces fit with a clean, cold click. Eirik wanted the throne. A war with Ostmark reignited by a border ambush would have killed Bjorn and thrown the succession into chaos, convenient for a scheming uncle. When that failed, thanks to Ylva's antidote, Eirik pivoted to eliminating the one witness who could unravel the plan. Her. Toke supplied the poisons, because Toke was a coward who had been made complicit years ago and no longer had the spine to refuse. The spear that nearly killed Bjorn had been forged to look foreign, and had instead been forged in Erik's own household smithy, under a mark Bjorn recognized and had chosen, out of some misplaced familial loyalty, not to speak aloud. Ylva confronted Bjorn with all of it on a cold morning, 3 days after the dog attack, standing in the training yard while he sharpened a blade he hadn't touched in weeks, and watched his amber eyes go from disbelief to something far darker, as every piece she laid out matched a suspicion he'd been unwilling to voice himself. "My own uncle," he said, quiet, and then quieter. "You've been in this hall a month, and you've solved what my entire council couldn't in years. Your council wasn't looking for a poison, only a border healer would recognize," Ylva said. "I was raised on it. Literally, it killed 11 men in my father's hall when I was 16. I've spent 4 years making sure I'd never be caught unprepared by it again." Something in Bjorn's face shifted then, something that had been building since the riverbank, and he said, low, "I was told you were sent here as a formality, a signature on a treaty. I have never in my life met a formality who could save my life twice and unravel a conspiracy in the same month." "Then perhaps," Ylva said, "you should stop listening to whoever described me that way." He did not answer with words. He answered by taking her hand, turning it palm up, and pressing his mouth briefly, deliberately, to the calluses at the base of her fingers, the calluses of a healer's hand, exactly as Gudrun had named them, and Ylva felt something in her chest crack open that she had kept sealed since the day her father sold her north. But knowledge without proof was worthless against a lord with Erik's standing, and worse than worthless if Eirik realized how close they'd come before they were ready to move. Bjorn's solution was the only one Hrafunmark law allowed for a challenge against a blood relative of the ruling line, formal accusation before the full pack, resolved not by council vote, but by ritual combat in the stone arena beneath the hall, witnessed by every wolf-blooded member of the court, Eirik's guilt or innocence, to be proven not by argument, but by blood. Eirik, informed of the accusation, laughed in the great hall in front of 200 witnesses, and agreed instantly, certain that whatever evidence a foreign bride had assembled would collapse the moment it faced trial by combat rather than trial by proof. Certain, too, that Bjorn, still weeks recovered from a poisoning meant to kill him, would not survive a duel against a man 20 years his senior in full health. Sigmar, to everyone's surprise, sided with his older cousin without hesitation the moment the accusation named Eirik directly, muttering something about mockery being one thing and murder being another. And Toke, when questioned privately by Gudrun under threat of exposure, broke within the hour and confirmed everything: the poisons, the payments, the forged spear, though his confession alone, delivered in private, still would not satisfy Hrafnmark law. Only the arena would. The arena beneath Hrafnmark's hall was carved from the same black stone as the fortress above it, a circular pit open to the sky, tiered stone benches rising on all sides where, on the appointed evening, the entire pack gathered beneath torchlight to watch their sovereign fight his own blood for the truth. Ylva stood at the pit's edge, not permitted to fight. Law forbade it. She was neither pack nor proven claimant. Forced instead to watch, hands clenched so tight, her nails cut crescents into her palms, as Bjorn and Eirik faced each other across 20 feet of packed earth, both men already shifting, fur bleeding across skin, jaws lengthening, the transformation Ylva had only ever heard whispered about, happening in front of 200 witnesses and her. Eirik struck first, faster than his silver beard suggested, a blur of gray fur and teeth that caught Bjorn's shoulder before he'd fully shifted and opened a line of blood down his arm. The crowd roared. Ylva's stomach dropped through the floor of the world. But Bjorn had spent 3 weeks recovering under her exact care, eating the strength-building broths she'd insisted on, sleeping the full nights she'd forced on him against his own stubbornness, and when he came back up from the strike, it was with a speed that made the crowd's roar catch in its collective throat. He drove Eirik back across the ring, wolf against wolf, until Eric's spine hit the black stone wall and Bjorn's jaws closed at his uncle's throat. Not killing. Not yet, because Hrafnmark law demanded a confession spoken aloud before the killing blow, and Bjorn held there, trembling with restraint, until Eirik, staring death in the face for the second time in a month, finally screamed the words the entire pack needed to hear: that he had ordered the ambush, imported the poison, forged the spear with his own smith's mark, and paid Toke to keep him silent, all of it to clear a path to a throne he believed should have been his brother's, and, by blood right descending from there, his own. The confession echoed off the black stone walls and died into 200 people's silence. Bjorn released his uncle's throat and stepped back, breathing hard, blood-streaked, and looked up, not at the pack, not at Sigmar, not at the elders rising from their tiered benches to pronounce judgment, but at Ylva, standing at the pit's edge with her hands still bleeding faint crescents into her own palms, and in that look was every ounce of the devotion he had been circling since the riverbank, and had finally, publicly, stopped pretending he didn't feel. "This woman," Bjorn said, loud enough for every tier of stone to carry it, still standing over his uncle's shifted, shaking form, arrived in this hall as a treaty formality that half of you mocked at a welcome feast. She pulled poison from my blood with a stolen cooking pot on a riverbank. She solved in a month what my own council failed to see in years. And she stood at the edge of this arena, forbidden by our own law from fighting for her own life, and trusted me to finish what she started." He crossed the ring, blood still wet on his shoulder, and took her hand in front of the entire assembled pack. "I do not want a political bride. I want a mate who sees what everyone else misses. Ylva Sturlsdottir, I am done pretending this was ever a formality." The roar that answered him this time was not mockery. It was the sound of 200 wolf-blooded warriors, many of whom had laughed at her a month before, recognizing exactly what kind of woman had walked into their hall, covered in mud, and left it standing beside their sovereign, unbroken. The elders' judgment came within the hour, delivered with the flat finality of law rather than mercy. Eirik, stripped of title and blood name, exiled beyond Hrafnmark's borders before dawn, forbidden ever to shift within packlands again, on pain of true death. Toke, the coward physician, was spared execution only at Ylva's own request. She argued, quietly, before the elders, that a man who breaks that easily under pressure was never truly dangerous, only weak, and that Hrafnmark had more use for a healer stripped of his old position and set to work under Gudrun's unforgiving supervision than for one more corpse, though his hands would never again touch a patient without 3 others watching. Sigmar, the cruel-mouthed cousin who had once called her a broodmare, not worth the grain that paid for her, sought Ylva out that same night, found her alone at the hearth, and said, with none of his old mockery, "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly, so I'll just say it plainly. I was wrong, and I'm glad the price of 6 wagons of grain turned out to be the only reason this hall still has a sovereign at all." Ylva accepted it for exactly what it was worth, no more, no less, and told him that gratitude paid better in future respect than in words at a hearth fire, which made the corner of his mouth twitch into something almost like the smile he should have offered her a month before. Gudrun, when Ylva found her the following morning sorting silver-leaf root with the same steady hands that had first named her a healer instead of a bride, only said, "Told you, court hand couldn't have done what you did on that riverbank. Court hands don't know how to save anything." She pressed a fresh bundle of silver-leaf into Ylva's palm, the first of what would become, over the following years, a full apprenticeship passed from one healer to another, and said nothing more, because nothing more needed saying. Bjorn found Ylva at the same training yard where he had first taken her hand, 3 days after the trial, his shoulder healing clean under linen she had wrapped herself, and this time he did not hesitate at all. He knelt, an act that made the 2 guards stationed nearby visibly startle, because sovereigns of Hrafnmark did not kneel, not for treaties, not for elders, not for anyone, and asked her, plainly, without the ceremony of court or the weight of politics attached to it, whether she would choose this life, this hall, this bond, not as payment for 6 wagons of grain, but as her own decision, freely made. Ylva, who had spent every year since her mother's death learning to survive by watching rather than trusting, found that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not have to calculate the answer at all. "I already saved your life once for free," she told him, pulling him back to his feet by the collar of his tunic, something almost like a smile breaking across her face, for the first time since the wagon train. "I might as well make it official." The bond mark ceremony took place beneath the same black stone arena 3 weeks later, but this time there was no combat, no confession, no blood, only firelight, and the full pack gathered not to witness judgment but celebration, and Ylva Sturlsdottir, once traded north as a formality worth 6 wagons of grain, stood at the center of it wearing a healer's mark on one wrist and a sovereign's bond mark on the other, exactly the 2 things the girl in that mud-streaked wagon train would never have believed either possible. So here is the question worth sitting with tonight. How many people in your own life have decided who you are before you ever got the chance to show them, and how many of them would still be laughing if they saw what you were truly capable of the moment the pressure finally broke? If this story reminded you that the quiet ones are usually the ones worth watching most closely, don't scroll past without hitting follow, because tomorrow's story is even darker than this one. An Omega healer no one believed, a curse no physician could name, and a sovereign who has exactly 1 night to learn the difference between the mate he was promised and the mate he actually needed all along.